It is France, the year 1425, and the country has been ravaged by decades of war with the English. The country was split into three bitterly divided factions. The English control the northern half of France, including the key cities of Paris, Rouen, and Reims. In the south, the Dauphin, the uncrowned King of France, Charles VII, rules. In the north and east, large swaths are under the sway of the Burgundian faction, Frenchmen who had thrown in with the Duke of Burgundy and were giving vital support to the English. This was the result of the seemingly unending conflict that would come to be known as the 100 Years' War. It is during these inauspicious times that a young girl named Joan begins to have visions. Just 13 at the time, Joan goes outside to tend to her family's garden when she is struck down by a glorious vision of the archangel Michael. Michael is surrounded by legions of angels and bathed in a stunning light. This would be Joan's first vision, but it would not be her last. Joan attested time and time again that she received these visions frequently, and in them, Michael told her that it was her sworn and sacred duty to see the French king return to his rightful throne and to expel the English from the land. She was going to save France. It is said that Joan fell down and wept at the sight of the vision because it was so beautiful, and her only wish was for the angels to take her away with them to the heavenly realms. They refused. Joan had a job to do first. These visions galvanized the young Joan who, still barely a teenager, began to pester the local officials. She must have an audience with the French monarch. It was her destiny. Unsurprisingly, her pleas went unheeded. She was turned away like the delusional child that she was. Much has been made about Joan's visions. Did she actually have them? Were they divine in origin? Or was Joan simply mentally ill? Whatever the root cause of the visions, their outcome is undeniable. Spurred on by invisible force, some power of destiny that seeped into her soul, Joan would end up being the spark that ignited the fire that would finally bring the 100 Years' War to an end. Hello and welcome to Forgotten and Found. Today marks the beginning of the end of our first season of the podcast. This will be a two-part series about Joan of Arc and the historical events that surrounded her. Most people are familiar with the image of the French heroine. She has become an icon to many for her willingness to take a stand and fight for what she believed in. She bucked the trends and standards of the day and arguably changed the world. However, the actual story of Joan of Arc is much darker than the sanitized version most people are familiar with. By today's standards, Joan was a child when she began her ordeal. She was unabashedly used by powerful men to achieve their aims. These men allowed her to march into battle. They gave into her visions and self-aggrandizement. They passed her into the hands of extremely dubious characters, and when her usefulness ran its course, they discarded her. Furthermore, no one protected her from the darkest and basest elements of French society at the time. As we will see, some of her closest confidants and men-at-arms were monsters. This is a story that features the exploitation of a young woman, if not outright child abuse. The end result of the story is another group of grown men deciding to burn her at the stake. It is a wild tale, and for some reason, everyone seems fine with the image and person of Joan of Arc because she won. Because the church decided to sanitize and rehabilitate her image long after her ashes had gone cold. Because she was the image of a powerful woman. Because she received visions from God. Whatever the reason, most people have decided to cling to one aspect that they see as good within the Joan of Arc legend and then discard the bad. And there is so much bad. There is so much wrong with this story. We cannot talk about Joan of Arc and her eventual exploits without first discussing the 100 Years' War as a whole. The 100 Years' War was a conflict that erupted between France and England in 1337. The war initially started as a dispute over the French throne. In 1328, Charles IV of France died without any legitimate male heirs and threw the realm into chaos. The English, through the House of Plantagenet, claimed the throne by way of Edward III, who was Charles's nephew. Unwilling to allow the English to seize the throne, the French nobility rejected the claim based on the Salic inheritance law, which forbids inheritance through a female relative. Instead, the French raised Philip VI of Valois to the throne, kicking off a conflict that would burn for a century. The first phase of the war saw England invade and consolidate large portions of the French countryside in a bid to win over the nobility and the locals while trying to take the throne by force. The English crossed the Channel and quickly subdued the important city of Calais before spreading into Normandy, Brittany, and Gascony. English seizure of French lands would fuel the conflict throughout its duration. The French wanted to secure French lands and to expel the English, while the English were attempting to forge a new Anglo-Franco state with the power ruling from England via compliant vassals. The war had its ebbs and flows. The English were highly successful during the first quarter, the French rebounded during the second quarter, then there was a break and something of a stalemate before the French regrouped and launched themselves towards victory. While most of the people lumped the conflict together as one long war today, it really was a series of small wars that were bound up under the same conflict. There were multiple pieces, treaties, and lulls. It wasn't non-stop fighting for 100 years. Joan of Arc was the catalyst that helped France regroup and find a will to put the war to bed for good. When Joan received her first vision, the war had been raging for nearly 90 years. So how did a teenage peasant girl rise up and help end one of history's most protracted conflicts? Joan of Arc was the catalyst that helped France regroup and find a will to put the war to bed for good. When Joan received her first vision, the war had been raging for nearly 90 years. So how did a teenage peasant girl rise and help end one of history's most protracted conflicts? The details are the stuff of legend. In 1428, the king-in-waiting Charles VII remained uncrowned. The French kings were always traditionally crowned at the city of Reims. The problem was, the city was in the north of the country under Burgundian control, and they had firmly squashed any idea that Charles would be coronated. Charles was the king in all but name, but he wanted to be crowned correctly. Crowning himself at a different city would immediately undermine his legitimacy, and considering legitimacy for the French throne was the source of the entire war, he could not risk undermining his position further. During Joan's time, Charles's position was bleak. The English controlled more than half the country, and they were slowly closing in around the city of Orleans, which was one of the last major French strongholds still standing. With Orleans in their possession, the English could easily use it as a launching point for a final invasion of southern France, where Charles was biding his time. Joan's meteoric rise from obscurity began in 1428, when her visions took on a more commanding tone. While she claimed that angels had told her of her destiny when she was just 13, it was now, in 1428, that she says Michael told her to leave her home and go directly to assist Charles. She immediately began to pester the local garrison commander, Robert de Baudricourt, about her visions. The man sent her away. When she returned, he sent her away again, this time more harshly. Joan wanted the garrison to give her an escort to Charles's court, which was hundreds of miles away in the resort city of Chinon in the Loire Valley. Joan's insistence that her visions were real and her zeal won over many of Baudricourt's own soldiers. So when Joan returned again for a third time, the commander relented. He provided her with 6 soldiers as an escort across the countryside, but demanded that she wear men's clothing in order to hide the fact that she was a young maiden. It was for her own safety, but Joan took the idea to heart, and she never wore women's clothing again from that point forward. This is a stepping off point for Joan of Arc, and this is when she enters the wider world. Immediately, she's turned over into the care of 6 men by herself, and is dressed in men's clothing to hide the fact that she is a vulnerable and young maiden traveling across a war-torn country, essentially by herself. In a different world, this story ends very differently. There were dozens of similar women who vanished in similar situations. But Joan does not vanish. Against all odds, or perhaps thanks to divine intervention, she makes it to her destination and is put in front of the Dauphin Charles VII of France in the city of Chinon in 1429. Joan arrives after walking over 200 miles across France, accompanied by just 6 regular guards. From the moment that Charles VII meets Joan of Arc, he doesn't know what quite to make of her, or what to do with her. He realizes that a person proclaiming that God is going to ensure that he is crowned king, and that events are in motion that will evict the English from France, could be useful. But he doesn't know how to capitalize on such wild proclamations. The exact details of the meeting between Joan, then 17, and Charles, age 26, have been lost, but everyone says that it was a productive one. Charles wanted to tap into Joan's zealous belief in her own visions and take some of it for himself. Everything Charles did was calculating. Charles was a flamboyant leader, but he was also a shrewd one. In order to legitimize himself, he first had to legitimize Joan, so he sent her away to the city of Poitiers to be vetted by a group of trusted Catholic theologians. If her claims were considered to be real, then she could be of use. However, Charles could not risk the chance that Joan was a witch or a sorceress. Having a witch in his court would only give the English more arrows to lob at him. While in Chinon, Joan also crosses paths with a man by the name of Giles de Rais for the first time. Rais was one of the highest-ranking captains in the Dauphine's personal guard and a prominent military figure of the time. Rais is immediately taken by Joan, and some say the fascination was deeper than mere curiosity. While everyone was interested in Joan and her story, Rais made sure that his destiny would intertwine with that of the young maiden. Remember the name Giles de Rais, because we will be revisiting him later. This is the first time that Joan will be taken and used by a powerful French figure, but it won't be the last. There was the possibility that the theological court at Poitiers found Joan to be a heretic or a witch, and that would have been the end of it right there. Charles knew that. And whether Joan grasped the full implications of being vetted by the church at this moment in her life, it is impossible to say. She was clearly sure of her own visions and her own piety, but would everyone else see it the same way? Again, Joan was thrust into an uncertain situation in which she had no real power. She trusted God to see her through, but how many times could she be shipped across the country before her luck ran out? Joan is vetted by the clergy and found to be a good Catholic. They did not find any signs of heresy or black magic within her. However, they could not verify her visions, and they refused to sanction them as true messages from God. When asked how they could be sure that her visions were legitimate, Joan reportedly replied that if they allowed her to go to Orleans, the site of the next major battle, then God would give them the sign that they were asking for. It was a bold statement, but one that she was about to back up with action. She was then observed and examined by a royal doctor before being released to Orleans. During her trek to Poitiers and back, the English had laid siege to Orleans in earnest. It seemed as though the whole war effort up until this point hung in the balance. If the English managed to take Orleans, French morale could very well collapse, and Charles's tenuous claim on the French throne would be dashed in the mud. The noose was tightening around the city, but the English armies had not yet managed to isolate it completely. Joan was permitted by the Dauphin to accompany the relief army. It was a long column of French troops aimed at relieving the beleaguered defenders and bringing much-needed food and weapons. Joan was touted as an oddity and a morale booster. The men were gladdened by the sight of her and took heart in her victorious message. She was giving the people hope, and that was something that had been in desperately short supply in recent years. Joan was never sent to Orleans to lead troops or even to fight. She had been dressed up like a soldier and touted as an oracle, but she was a young peasant girl with no military experience other than seeing the aftermath of the war in the countryside as she rode from town to town. Despite that, Joan ensured that she was always close to the fighting. As she continued to make prophetic declarations, the men became more enamored with her. The religious and superstitious began to see her as a legitimate prophet, and they began to ask her for military advice. Joan of Arc had slipped her leash. Soon she was leading troops, giving directions to captains, and directing the fighting against the English. She wasn't there to boost morale, she was there to lift the siege of Orleans. Everywhere Joan rode, the men were lifted. Multiple times, Joan rode up to retreating French soldiers and bid them to turn around and continue to fight. They always did. When the officers ordered retreats, Joan demanded that the men continue their assaults. Her offensive mindset paid off, and the French gradually pushed the English back. During the final assault on the English besiegers on May 7, 1429, Joan was struck by an arrow, but she rose with her banner and bid the French to keep fighting. Again, they heeded her call, and ended up routing the English forces completely, who retreated and lifted the siege of Orleans. After the stunning victory, Joan stood up and proclaimed that the clergy had asked her for a sign, and she told them that Orleans was to be her sign. This was God's vision made manifest. Joan became a national hero and was lifted up as a true prophet, someone truly blessed and in communication with God. But she wasn't done yet. The archangel Michael had not told her that she was here to lift the siege of Orleans. He had told her that she was to oversee the crowning of Charles VII at Reims. The problem was that Reims was still miles behind enemy lines and was still under control of the traitorous Burgundians. The French court was skeptical, but she bid them to march northward through enemy territory to the city of Reims. God would see them through. Joan marched with the French army north to the historic city, the City of Kings, the only place where the Dauphin Charles VII could be legitimately crowned. The army encountered no resistance on its trek northward. The city of Reims wisely opened the gates for the triumphant army, and Charles was quickly coronated. Joan stood front and center during the proceedings and proclaimed that God's will had been fulfilled in their presence. It was a remarkable scene, and one that Joan is remembered for. This story might have ended as a happy one if this were the final chapter, but unfortunately for Joan, it wasn't the final chapter. Charles VII had got what he wanted. He reclaimed the City of Kings, got his crown, and was no longer the Dauphin, but the full and legitimate King of France. Now he had two other growing problems to deal with. First, the English still controlled large portions of the country, including Paris. Some had naively hoped that the Duke of Burgundy would return to the French fold after the victories against the English. He didn't. The Duke continued to be a pest and showed no inclination of turning his back on the English. The Burgundian faction would remain a problem for the foreseeable future as they continued to cling to a large portion of the important territory in central France. The second problem was what to do with Joan herself. Joan was undoubtedly the most popular figure in France at the time, and that was bad for the freshly coronated king who was eager to consolidate his power. Joan was highly useful, but she was also highly dangerous. Demagogues were always dangerous to those in power and seeking power. Everyone knew that if Joan raised her banner, thousands of loyal French Catholics would follow it. If Charles would keep Joan under control, she would be a valuable asset, but few in Charles's court were confident in their ability to do so. She had already won over a number of important figures in the French military who had taken an unhealthy interest in the young woman and her divine claims. Joan had also shown time and time again that she answered to a higher calling. Whether you believe that calling was God or not, she showed at Orleans that she was more than happy to flaunt standards in the chain of command. Joan was a loose cannon, and she was a highly popular one at that. Something had to be done. This is where the story of Joan of Arc takes a dark turn. Power, politics, and scheming overwhelmed the young girl. Charles shrewdly watched Joan during the siege of Orleans and realized that the woman had no quit. She was all offense. She believed wholeheartedly in her ability to turn the tide of any battle that she was in, and now he was going to use that character trait against her. In March of 1430, Joan organizes a military expedition to try and retake the French city of Compiègne from the Burgundians. According to the official record, Joan acted without the approval of the French king. She struck out on her own, just as many had feared that she would. However, others say that there was no way that Joan could have gathered an army of any size for this expedition if she didn't have the tacit or secret support from the king himself. It is in this moment that all of Joan's flaws are brought to the surface. She was too aggressive, too self-assured, and too predictable. Charles let Joan lead the ill-fated attack on the city, which ended in an absolute failure. Joan was quickly captured by the Burgundians and held for a sizable ransom. A ransom that the French showed no interest in paying. Once Joan fell into the hands of her enemies, the French court turned its back on her. This odd behavior seemingly confirms the suspicions of some that Joan was set up. It was likely that Charles wanted her out of the way, and he got his wish by maneuvering her into an unwinnable position. Joan likely believed that the French would rescue her or bail her out, but they did neither. They didn't even make any motions or public shows of support. They completely abandoned her. With no interest from Charles VII materializing, the Burgundians sold Joan to the English instead, securing the sizable ransom. The English were more than happy to take Joan and put her on trial for heresy. They saw Joan as a dangerous military threat, and it is likely that the French saw her the same way. Joan is accused of having demonic visions rather than angelic ones, and refusing to submit to the will of the church. Her prophecies were smeared as evil, and her conduct, including dressing as a man, were painted as subversive. Joan was no agent of God. She was a heretic, at best, and a witch, at worst. To her credit, Joan attempted to escape 3 times from her custody, with the most extreme attempt seeing her jump out of a tower window into a dry moat where she broke a leg and was quickly recaptured. As soon as Joan was put on trial, her fate was sealed. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. Joan was sentenced to death by burning. She was tied to a stake after being given her sacraments. A crucifix was put into her hands, which were then bound. Joan spent her last moments staring at the cross. She never wavered in her faith. Joan was burned alive on May 30th, 1431, after a year spent in custody. Her ashes were thrown unceremoniously into the River Seine, the final fate of all heretics. Joan's remarkable moment in history lasted but 2 brief years. She was 19 when she died. The story of Joan of Arc has been sanitized over the years. It took decades for the church to rehabilitate her image, and the story is a sad one. A young girl sacrifices her life for the good of her country, but it didn't have to be this way. Joan was manipulated from the jump by Charles VII. She was used as a political pawn to advance the plans of the French court, and when her usefulness had run its course, they abandoned her to die an inglorious death at the hands of her enemies. If Joan's visions were fake or born out of an underlying mental illness, the story gets sadder still. This is yet another story of a young woman being manipulated, exploited, and eventually killed by powerful men. She never had any real leverage in the situation, and she learned the hard lesson that many women throughout history have learned. Some see Joan as a martyr at the hands of the English, but she was really martyred at the hands of the French. Charles could have launched a campaign to see her freed. He could have negotiated for her release, paid her ransom, or even made a plea for mercy for the girl. He did none of these things. He was calculating and cold, some would say even cruel. He was more than happy to let Joan die because she was a threat to his grip on power. After Joan was captured in the ill-fated raid, those who had cheerfully turned her into a heroine overnight were more than happy to turn her into a martyr next. Joan of Arc's story is often told as one of triumph, a peasant girl who rose to command armies and secure the throne for Charles VII. But in reality, hers is a deeply tragic tale of manipulation, abandonment, and martyrdom. From the moment she arrived at the court in Chinon, Joan was a tool in the hands of powerful men, used for their political and military ambitions. The desperate Charles VII, whose claim on the throne was fragile, saw her as a means to rally his demoralized troops and give divine legitimacy to his kingship. His advisors, many of whom were skeptical of her, allowed her to lead armies not out of a belief in her visions, but because they recognized that she could inspire the masses and turn the tide of war. Yet when Joan's usefulness had run its course, she was discarded. After her miraculous victories, the court became wary of her growing influence. Joan, ever determined, wanted to push forward. Her goal was to retake Paris and drive the English entirely out of France, but Charles and his council hesitated. They had achieved what needed to be done, his coronation at Reims, and saw no reason to risk further battle. When Joan was captured by the Burgundians, Charles VII, the very man she had fought to put on the throne, made no effort to ransom her. He had gained legitimacy, and a captured Joan, no longer under his control, was a liability. Instead, she was left in the hands of her enemies, who were determined to see her destroyed. Her trial was a sham, a predetermined condemnation orchestrated by the pro-English bishop Pierre Cauchon. She faced relentless interrogation, accusations of heresy, and political maneuvering designed to strip her of the divine authority that had once made her so powerful. When she refused to submit to the church's demands and recant her claims of divine guidance, she was sentenced to death. Even in her final moments, when she briefly recanted under duress, her captors saw to it that she would burn anyways, lest she ever be freed. Joan of Arc's story is not one of victory, but of sacrifice and betrayal. She was a young girl, used as a political weapon, and then left to die when she was no longer convenient. The very king she had bled for did nothing to save her. Though she was later canonized and transformed into the saintly figure that we know today, this posthumous redemption does not change the fact that her life was stolen from her by the very forces she had sought to save. Hers was not the tale of a chosen warrior fulfilling a divine destiny, but of a young woman led to slaughter by those who valued power more than loyalty. But the story gets even more twisted. Remember Giles de Rice, the man I briefly mentioned earlier? He turned out to be the first confirmed serial killer in history. The story of de Rice following the execution of Joan of Arc is more deranged than anyone could have imagined. His unhealthy obsession with Joan should have raised red flags in court, but Charles had shown time and time again that he was more interested in power and victory than he was in loyalty or morality. Giles de Rice would prove to be a true monster, a person whose deplorable actions are unrivaled in this era and nearly unrivaled in all history. But that is a story for next week. Thank you for listening to Forgotten and Found. Next week we will dive into the dark mind of Giles de Rice. He caps off our dive into the story of Joan of Arc, which turns out to be a darker and sadder tale than most people realize. It will get darker and sadder still. So stick around for the epic conclusion of this story and our first season here at Forgotten and Found. If you want to support my work, please head over to grantpiperwriting.medium.com, and until next time, be good and God bless.